You to this discussion on the conflict, disaster, and displacement nexus, implications for protection and resilience in the Horn of Africa. Taking the opportunity of the presence in New York of Professor Walter Kalin, who's sitting on my right, who's envoy of the chairmanship of the Nansen Initiative, a Norwegian and Swiss-led initiative on cross-border displacement in the context of disasters. This event aims to explore and reflect on the implications that the multi-causal and multi-layered nature of displacement has on efforts to provide protection and assistance to displaced people and to strengthen their resilience. And we will have a particular focus on the Horn of Africa. Indeed, probably more than anywhere else, the Horn of Africa illustrates this complex relationship between disaster, conflict, and displacement. In 2011 and 2012, the Horn of Africa experienced its worst drought in 60 years, affecting more than 13 million people in Somalia, Kenya, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Djibouti. Although thousands of people were displaced all across the region, Somalia, a country that has been affected by more than 2 decades of conflict, was very much at the epicenter of the crisis, with the UN declaring in July 2011 a famine in parts of southern Somalia that affected approximately 3.7 million people. The drought prompted hundreds of thousands of Somalis to flee in search of food, water, and humanitarian assistance, including across borders in neighboring countries like Kenya, Ethiopia, but also Yemen, adding to the tens of thousands of Somali refugees that were already present in these countries. This humanitarian crisis has been described as the result of a perfect storm of concurrent conflict, drought, and poor governance. Indeed, the catastrophic impact of the drought in Somalia in particular, in sharp contrast with some of its neighbors, was exacerbated by more than 2 decades of conflict in the country, resulting in disrupted markets and damaged infrastructures, weak governance and weak states' capacity to strengthen the resilience of communities and overall development, and constrained humanitarian access, forcing people to seek refuge across borders. This crisis highlighted the gaps in international and regional legal frameworks to fully address the distinct protection needs of people displaced across borders in the context of disasters. While some people from drought-affected areas were able to benefit from refugee status and assistance in receiving countries, some others did not. It therefore also highlighted that any policy or response to displacement in the context of disasters must also address the multi-causal nature of displacement, including this nexus between conflict and disaster. This complex nexus can be looked at from different perspectives. Climate change resulting in more frequent and severe disasters, as well as overall environmental degradation, can in turn lead to conflict as it exacerbates competition for resources and social tension. But also displacement resulting from slow or rapid onset disasters can by itself lead to conflict as it can create tensions and potential violence in places of destination. Conflict and violence and the resulting breakdown of law and governance can in turn impact the ability of communities to cope with disasters and the ability of aid workers to deliver humanitarian aid, leading to increased displacement, including across borders. And finally, the legitimate security and stabilization concerns of states and regional organizations in response to conflict, violence, and insecurity may themselves have an impact on the ability of communities to move, for instance, through the tightening of border controls due to fear of armed group or terrorist infiltrations. So with this background in mind, our panelists will attempt to provide answers to some of the following questions. What are the links and causal relations between disasters, conflict, and displacement in a region like the Horn of Africa? Secondly, how do security considerations impact human mobility in the region in general, but more particularly, how do they impact efforts to provide protection and assistance to people displaced in disaster context? How could the gaps in international and regional legal frameworks be addressed to ensure better protection of displaced people and a more efficient response? And finally, what are the implications of this complex nexus on the resilience of the population and broader development needs? So with this brief introduction, I would now like to give the floor to our panelists for a 7 to 8 minute presentation each. Since you have a short biography of each of them in your papers, I will not take too much time in describing their impressive experience and distinguished careers, but will limit myself to some highlights. Professor Walter Kalin, who many of you know from his former position of representative of the UN Secretary General on the human rights of internally displaced people, a position that he held from 2004 to 2010, is now as I mentioned before, the envoy of the chairmanship of the Nansen Initiative. And in that capacity, he will share with us some observations from especially from a round of regional consultations that are currently taking place in the Horn of Africa. Udo Jens on my left, who I probably don't need to introduce to most of you, has been the director of the New York office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees since 2010, and he will reflect on the operational experience of its organization in the Horn of Africa, including during the 2011 crisis, but also he will reflect on his own 25-year personal experience working on these issues for the UNHCR. And finally, Samuel Doe on my far left, Senior Policy Advisor and Team Leader in the Policy and Planning Division of UNDP's Bureau for Crisis Prevention and Recovery, known as BCPR, will draw on his own decade-long experience with the UN, as well as 15 years as a civil society leader in Africa, to explore the implications this complex nexus has for resilience building and for the broader post-2015 UN Development Agenda discussions. So without any further ado, we'll give the floor to Walter.
Thank you, Jérémie. Thank you very much for having organized this gathering. Thank you very much for joining us here over lunch. What are we talking about? I remember back in 2010 in northern Uganda when it became possible for those who had been displaced internally for so many years, had been in these camps. Finally, they were able to go back. And I met a community midway, camping out somewhere, and they couldn't really go back because of the drought at that time. They were very nice. It was quite funny. When we were there, it had rained a little bit the night before. They were thanking me for bringing the rain, but it didn't help much. When I was in Mogadishu in March 2013, a city really where every empty space is no longer empty, but you have IDPs everywhere. And an estimated 2/3 arrived during the drought in 2010, 2011. Talking to people, we would like to go back, but we can't. Still, lack of security. And even more importantly, the whole rural infrastructure is collapsed and nobody's there to help to rebuild it. If we're looking at these kind of people from a normative perspective, they are quite well off as internally displaced persons. They are protected by applicable international law, soft law standards such as the guiding principles on internal displacement, and in Africa, of course, the Kampala Convention on Protection and Assistance to IDPs in Africa, that is mentioning those displaced by natural disasters and by the effects of climate change. But what about those that were just mentioned, that have to cross borders? They are not refugees if you are looking at it from a global perspective. Maybe they are refugees, as we will discuss in the next few minutes, but it's very unclear what their situation is. And this is where I come to the Nansen Initiative. Some of you might have heard of it, most probably not. What is the Nansen Initiative about? It goes back to the climate change negotiations. The humanitarian community in the run-up to the Copenhagen conference of parties had pushed a message that when you're talking about adapting to climate change, do not be naive. Do not think that with all the adaptation measures, everyone can stay. Some people will have to move. Some people will be displaced. And it's important to build into the adaptation response the issue of people that are displaced, that migrate, that have to be relocated in an organized, planned way. This was recognized in 2010 in the Cancun Adaptation Framework, and the question then was where to take it from there. There have been some attempts to ask the High Commissioner for Refugees to engage, but many governments were a bit hesitant. And it was in that context that Switzerland and Norway stood up and said, let's start the process outside of the UN with interested states, particularly in those regions that are very much affected. Let's start to consult, to learn from each other. Let's start to build consensus bottom up on an issue that is highly complex, that is highly sensitive. The issue of what the media call climate refugees. And you have heard the predictions of what might happen in the next decades or towards the end of the century, particularly if you're not managing to limit the greenhouse gas emissions. In that context, the Nansen Initiative was started with a small group of states, including Costa Rica, Mexico, the Philippines, Kenya, Australia, Germany, Bangladesh, besides Switzerland and Norway. I think I didn't mention Mexico. And this small group of states actually has started a process of regional consultations. We were in the Pacific, we were in Central America, and the next consultation, and that's why the reason the reason for this meeting, we will have a intergovernmental consultation in the Horn of Africa region in May 21st to 23rd May, hosted by the government of Kenya. I had been traveling in the region, very positive response from governments in Uganda, in Djibouti, Ethiopia, Somalia, the countries that are affected, Tanzania, and so on. Having said that, what are the problems? What we see are three situations. First, the one that was already mentioned, the Somalia drought, and the fact that neighboring states, Ethiopia, Kenya, granted asylum to these persons that were displaced, even to those who said we have not been directly affected by the conflict. Using the wide notion of the African Refugee Convention that talks about the need to grant refugee status also to those who have to flee in the context of a breakdown of public order. And of course there was a breakdown of public order, but why was there a breakdown of public order? Because of the conflict. That's the nexus. Because of the weakness or the absence of authorities that could assist these people. And because the international community, the humanitarians, could not access the drought victims as a consequence of the conflict. But there are other situations. We have, since centuries, pastoralist groups adapting to drought, recurrent droughts. And since the colonial borders were drawn, these people sometimes have to cross borders from northern Kenya, Turkana, into Uganda, Karamoja region, from Kenya into Ethiopia, and vice versa. And the Maasai are crossing the border between Kenya and Tanzania. This was an established, well-working pattern. But difficulties, we were told when I went to the region and was talking to governments and NGOs, seem to be increasing. Difficulties because in the context of diminishing resources, conflicts erupt between communities. There is a proliferation of small arms. There is a legitimate interest of governments to control their borders in the context of the threat of terrorism. But this means less space for pastoralists. How are we going about it? And the third big problem, poverty. Poverty that has multiple reasons, but one of the reasons is a deteriorating environment, is drought. And then the phenomenon of irregular migrants. They don't have many ways to move regularly, to make a living somewhere, to send the money back. So the families could hold out, could adapt to those challenges. And again, we know what's happening to these people. They are exploited. They are moved into forced labor. Terrible stories we hear from what's happening. They are drowning in the sea. Again, protection concerns. What the Nansen Initiative is about is to discuss with governments on how to address all these issues. It's not about starting a new process. There are many processes going on, particularly in the Horn of Africa. There are good approaches, there are good models that could provide good practices, examples for other regions in the world. But it's important to bring all these streams of the discussions together, and that's what we are about, to facilitate that discussion, to catalyze it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Walter, for this enlightening presentation, but also for sticking very much to the time that I had imparted, 8 minutes on my chrono. That's perfect. Thank you so much. Then I will give the floor to Udo, who will share with us the operational experience of the UNHCR in the region and maybe draw some broader lessons on this complex issue of conflict, disaster, and displacement. Udo.
Thank you very much, Jérémie, and it's a pleasure, obviously, to sit on a panel together with Walter Kellen, who, as usual, is again at the forefront of something new, something normative that is in the making, and he has contributed in the past to many other such initiatives and has succeeded, so we hope he will do the same this time around. This is an issue that is with us now, and it will be with us to stay, and it will grow with us. The Nansen Initiative is a response from our reading, clearly, of climate change being not a figment of somebody's imagination for the future, but it is here with us, and we feel the impact today. Who is to say today whether the number of people who are crossing either the Mediterranean or who are crossing the Gulf of Aden are in fact driven by what? Climate change, persecution, drought, not being able to make a living on the soil that they had lived on for so many years, conflict. I think it is probably, in all likelihood, a compound of all of those reasons. And yet, as Professor Kellen already mentioned, we do not have an international instrument to accord refugee status for people leaving, among others, for reasons of being pushed out by climate-related changes in their country of origin. Now, that is the challenge. Can we rise up to this new pattern that we see increasingly taking place, or are we so confined within the constraints of the existing international regime to stick to the traditional convention grounds as to who is a refugee and who is not? That is becoming increasingly an impossible task. Sorry, this may sound like sacrilege, especially in front of the camera, but you can imagine a legal officer of UNHCR, well-versed and trained in how to afford refugee status to an individual after a lengthy interview and probably a series of interviews, and then to decide yay or nay. That is often a life-threatening decision. If you get it wrong, clearly if it is a persecutory reason that is being put forward as a claim, the consequences can be immediate if you are returned to the country of origin. If it is a compound of other reasons, it is much more difficult to discern what will happen if the person might ultimately be returned. Clearly, you wouldn't have a happy camper. And many people, as you know, have resisted that, and some even died in the process of being forcibly deported. Yesterday, in fact, it was. The Express newspaper in the UK issued this story with a headline talking about 24,000 people having drowned in the Mediterranean in their attempt to cross to the European Union from Africa in the spate of the last 14 years. 24,000. I have avoided putting a figure on it for many occasions when I had the occasion to speak on the issue. But I have seen figures floating around from NGOs who have made it their business to record every single recorded boat that has been recorded. And they have estimated it as 10,000 until now. This is quite a stark contrast, and this is all recorded incidents. So it probably still is the tip of the iceberg and not a reflection of the true figures. Now, what are the drivers? When I met some of those people in camps in Malta or in Lampedusa, myself, and I asked them, why do you risk your life? You know it is a risky business. 1 in 5 on average, we estimate it, dies in the process. They looked at me in total bafflement and said, it is the best lottery that we could possibly have. 1 in 5, that's great. I'm not going to be number 5. I will make it. And I have a family that I need to feed, and I have a God-given right to be able to put my energy into employment. Whether or not I'm recognized as a refugee is immaterial. Well, when the regional commissions of the Italian government do put the people to the test as to who is a refugee and who is not, they have recognized 1 in 5 to be leaving for those compounded reasons that ultimately give, with the benefit of the doubt perhaps, a refugee status and have accorded them that. With that, they're free to move around in Italy and beyond Italy in the European Union and to pursue their dream that clearly drives them in the first place. Now, the situation in Somalia, I have many other experts here in the room that are better qualified to speak to that. But just to give you some figures of the 90s, when we had the first drive of displacement, with 250,000 people estimated dying already as the compound of drought, destruction of crops, loss of livelihoods, brought about a complex emergency. 800,000 refugees fled to Kenya and Ethiopia in 1992. And we see the aberration still today in the largest refugee camp in the world that we've also mentioned on previous occasions. It's not a camp. It's a conglomerate of settlements, and it's 450,000 people, many of whom have been born of parents born in that settlement in northern Kenya called Dadaab. Can you imagine? You have left your entire life in a camp-like artificial setting with no prospects of livelihood other than the service industry within the camp setting. This is what a whole generation and two have been brought up with now. In addition, 2 million or so displaced within the country. And even today, by today's estimates, 1.1 million remain displaced within Somalia and another million as refugees outside. This is the largest group of people, apart from Afghans that we know well, and now Syrians that we also know well, in the world. Did you know that? The third largest country of origin that produces refugees or has produced refugees over the years, resulting in the third largest diaspora in the world. Now, this is really something that cannot be handled as business as usual. It's clear that we need some new thinking. The High Commissioner has brought together some experts only late last year to really look at all issues, put all the issues on the table, see what we can do together to try and create the conditions that we normally say, conditions conducive to return. That apply to both IDPs and refugees, clearly. But a lot more has to be brought into the equation than simply the security drivers on the one hand, that, for example, came as a result of the mall incident in Nairobi, where the Kenyan government has clearly tried to restrict the space for Somalis and has basically moved everybody to the extent possible to the camp settings. Internationally, we don't exactly see open borders. In fact, UNHCR felt compelled to give the Nansen Award, which we do annually, to a Yemeni NGO whose business it is to fish dead bodies out of the water and rescue those that are survivors and bring them into the nearest hospitals and prop them up to the extent that it can be done. But it continues. And every year when the sailing season starts, we face the same dilemmas. So I put that question up. I'm happy to talk about some of the other issues what kind of durable solutions we have in place for refugees, the impact of the Kampala Convention, which obviously we welcome, and we have one of the brains behind the Kampala Convention, among others, with us. The Kampala Convention was only signed very recently and has already been signed now by 39 states and ratified by 22. It is, again, at the forefront of creating international norms, like it was with the old OAU Convention that went much further than the Refugee Convention. And we see the same, if you like, standard setting coming from Africa, not coming from what you would perhaps expect the North with their enlightened backing of the original Refugee Convention. It comes from those areas in the world that produces the largest number of IDPs and refugees. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Udo. Now I would like to give the floor to Samuel, who will discuss about what does this mean for resilience building, and whether or not this complexity of reasons leading to displacement are taken into account in the post-2015 development framework discussion, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. It's good to be here from UNDP. And UNDP has been, along with DESA, been co-leading the exercise around the post-2015 agenda from the UN system side. And I have been co-leading with other agencies, area that focuses on this agenda of resilience, the nexus between conflict, violence, and environmental challenges that we face today. What I thought of doing would be, I see a few colleagues in the room who come from that region, the Horn of Africa, and I'm sure during the discussion they can say a bit more about the region. But what I'd like to do is just give us a snapshot of what the context of the Horn of Africa is that we are working in, that we are talking about, vis-a-vis the agenda of resilience and the movement of people. And those of you who have worked in the region would know that the Horn of Africa has over 70% of its landmass that is considered arid or semi-arid. And so over 70% of the space inhabited in that region will be considered environmentally challenged in terms of the level of the number of rainfall and the frequency of rainfall in the region. It's also a region in which the predominant culture there is a relationship between those who are pastoralists and those who are agro-pastoralists. They all depend on the land, and they all depend on the limited rainfall on the land. That's very important to know. This space, the landmass, the semi-arid region of the Horn of Africa is sparsely inhabited. It means the cohesiveness of communities is very, very limited in terms of habitation. So people live sparsely in small units, and that has an implication for their level of resilience, their level of strength, their level of collective action to deal with the humongous challenge they have that environment presents for them. So keep that also in mind. The other thing that I like to say in terms of context, what are the drivers? Knowing the sparse living, the environmental challenges, the semi-arid condition in which they find themselves, what are the core drivers that perpetuate the system that we're talking about? One, we know that the region, culture, history, geography, really is integral to the whole challenge of drought. Drought is not new, drought is not recent. Even though climate is exacerbating drought, drought is frequent, is recurrent in the Horn of Africa. From counting the statistics of IGAD, from 1935, almost every year you've had drought in the region, and exacerbated, of course, the biggest one being the 2011 drought that we're talking about. Again, while the socio-ecological implication for having pastoralists and agro-pastoralists living together means that there is a significant competition over the resources that they need to work with, which is land. The pastoralists are moving, they're nomads, and as far as they're concerned, there's no border and there's no refugee. They belong to Uganda, they belong to Ethiopia, they are Tanzanians, they are Kenyans. They don't understand the whole logic of having to have visa to go to Kenya when a few years ago that land belonged to their ancestors. So the logic of movement and the logic of identity is also significantly different from the current modern citizen notion that we have to wrestle with. The population and the way they cope is to produce more children. So population growth in the region is significantly high. It's one of the highest in the world. It's more than 3%. And so you need to keep that in mind as well, that the number of young people and youth vis-a-vis the challenge we have and who do not have the resources to be able to fend for themselves, to build a family, is also extremely high. The other thing I'd like to emphasize is given the contestation of our resources, we all know that it has become a system, a social system, a culture in the region, which is unfortunate, of the whole notion of counter-wrestling, the whole notion of the use of violence as a way of accessing resources, resources that are limited. So violence has, seeped into the culture, and it seemed to be given some value over time because of the history of this phenomenon we are talking about. And finally, I'd like to emphasize that we have years since the 80s of series of wars and violence from Uganda to Sudan, South Sudan, northern Uganda, Somalia. So there is a conflict system that is also overlapping with the environmental ecosystem challenges we have in the region. So conflict overlapping with environmental stress, overlapping with socio-ecological liabilities that we have, or vulnerabilities we have in the region. So this is the context that we're operating with. Now, if you look at that context and you bring it in the whole logic of resilience, what does this mean to build resilience in the Horn of Africa? For those of us who've worked with the whole concept of resilience, basically it is about how human beings and their communities can thrive in such a very difficult context in which they find themselves. So in spite of disasters, in spite of environmental stress, how can people thrive? What do they need to be able to thrive in that region? There are a number of key drivers of resilience that need to be in place in order for that thriving in environmental stress to be possible. One important driver is the human agency. The human agency in terms of people and their collective action, their intention to change their condition. Okay? And that is important for them to, you can have individuals who have resilience, but in a large scale, stressful environment, you need collective agency, you need collective action. So the level of organization, the level of mobilization, the level of leadership, and the size of the density, of the social density, is critical for resilience to be possible in the region. The other thing that is important for resilience to thrive, or for people to thrive, is the institutional fabric they have in that context. The institutional fabric, the governance system. A lot of the countries in the region do not have full access to the landmass they call their state. The Massa region, you don't necessarily have Kenyan police accessing a lot of those regions. If you go to South Sudan, dense forest, not many people can access those regions. So people live outside of the state. So bubbles of non-state inhabitation in a state fabric, in a state context that we are talking about. So the governance institutions do not reach those people, the chronic people we're talking about. The third phenomenon is the health of the people. Food and nutritional insecurity is vast, is huge, is persistent in the region. So you have chronic malnutrition, which has implication in terms of people's brain development and people's health as well. So the level of biological, psychobiological resistance to this stress is quite limited. And it's a factor that we have to wrestle with in terms of the vulnerability in the region. It is in this context that you have the 2011 major drought that has I have to run. That has caused the problem we've had. But what I just want to quickly talk about before moving to the post-2015, my last minute, is that an important hope for the region is the coming together of the various states under the IGAD rubric to be able to intentionally act together. They launched what they call the resilience strategy for IGAD, a 27-year strategy, strategy that goes until 2027, that has 5-year calibration for development response, that looks at 4 big areas: ensuring social protection systems across the countries that are in the region, ensuring that population movement is discussed and talked about in the region so that governments do not have rigid immigration system that undermine the movement of communities. It also has insurance system that ties in with the African Union also program there. And a lot of donors are responding in supporting, I'll say a bit more in the discussion on the IGAD plan. But the IGAD, in terms of there's a leadership, there's an intergovernmental leadership to deal with this long-term cultural and environmental challenge that is in the region. In terms of post-2015, for the last minute that I have, the international system is moving into defining a post-MDG framework that is much more ambitious, that is bold. And what makes it bold? There is the dream we have to eradicate poverty. Whatever that means. Eradicate poverty in a world in which 24,000 men and women die almost every year trying to cross the Gulf of Eden. It is a world in which you have the millions of people we talked about that live in the semi-arid region of the Horn and the Sahel that need to also come out of the devastating trap of poverty. It is a world in which you have the nexus of terrorism and conflict and violence interacting and undermining the fabric of societies across the world. It is in that world that we want to have a development framework that ends poverty in our lifetime. So it's a huge challenge, but it's a challenge from the recent experience of the MDG we are hopeful is surmountable. And that's where the international system is going. In order to do that, we have to look at the full breadth of issues that were not addressed in the MDG. The MDG was poverty-centric. We're saying now you cannot end poverty if you hurt the environment. So there has to be commitment to sustainability. There has to be commitment to the end of poverty as well. And that context brings together the nexus of environment and stress and conflict that we've talked about. So thankfully, so far, the ongoing discussion in the Open Working Group have identified or have mainstream resilience agenda in over 6 of the current 19 focal areas that have been identified. Those will be reduced, hopefully, as we move along. But for now, we have what we call the 19 focal areas. It might be 12 goals or 10 goals. The discussion is happening today as we speak in an Open Working Group. And out of those 19, and I'll say a bit more in the discussion, 6 of those have very strong representation or incorporation of disaster, environmental resilience, or climate resilience. That is our issue today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samuel. I realize it was very challenging to ask you to cover both the conflict aspects of this nexus, the impact it has on resilience of population, and also to discuss about the post-2015 discussion. So thank you very much to do your best to stick to the time. Now, before moving on to the discussion and giving the floor to our audience here for a Q&A, I would like to ask maybe a couple of questions to our panelists. First, maybe a question to Walter. As we heard here, and particularly from Samuel, displacement is by itself a coping mechanism for populations to adapt to disasters such as droughts, in particular in the Horn of Africa. Then my question would be, could you develop a bit more on how insecurity and conflict in the region can undermine and does undermine this coping mechanism, and what does it mean for the ability of people by themselves to face these issues.
Thank you. Let me first say I'm not a security expert, so I have to improvise a bit answering your question. But what we learned, what people in the region told us in the run-up to the intergovernmental consultation are different aspects. As was mentioned by Samuel, what I also had mentioned very shortly is that traditional adaptation mechanisms, meaning movements of communities, pastoralists, agro-pastoralists, including across the borders, are becoming more difficult because of increasing violence, because of proliferation of small arms, because of the terrorism issue. Not only that, it's also becoming more difficult because of responses by governments, and again, legitimate responses of governments to look at their security. And I think the big challenge is how to manage these tensions. These are real tensions, but how to manage them. There are good examples, good practices. We had organized a pre-consultation with civil society organizations, and we had one very good example from northern Uganda, where community leaders, where NGOs, where state representatives started to mediate between the host communities and the arriving community, to set the ground rules, to try to set certain standards of behavior, so to avoid that tensions would increase to real violence and conflict. I think that's a good thing. When we're talking about the resilience strategy, it was mentioned that IGAD is also calling for not closing the borders. And I think that's something that is, again, an aspect we have to look at. How can this be formalized so it's not depending on actual goodwill, but can become a kind of a regime? Some privileged access. To give you one example, and again, we're getting into very practical issues. We were discussing the free movement of person regime within the East African community, where people can move across borders, but you need certain kind of specific documents. And of course, poor people, pastoralists, but also others that have to cross the border do not necessarily have these kind of documents. They would need to have temporary access to the neighboring countries. So this would be another aspect. How can we shape free movement of persons regimes in a way that still legitimate interests of states are taken into account, but at the same time, even though they are usually motivated by economic integration, people can profit from it. We have been talking about the huge protection concerns in the context of irregular movements of persons in that region, and as a consequence of smuggling. If you're looking at Western Africa, I was told, again, I'm not a specialist, but I was informed that in ECOWAS, smuggling is no longer the big problem, because there's no longer a market for smugglers because of the free movement of persons regimes. So there are lots of good ideas and examples, but they have to be brought together, and they have to be kind of formalized at the regional, at the sub-regional level, so that we can manage these population movements in order to help, to assist, and to protect people who are under pressure to move because a multitude of reasons. This is another important aspect. It's never monocausal, but all of that might be and is exacerbated by deteriorating environments, by increasingly serious effects of climate change.
Thank you, Walter. Udo, you want to add something?
Yeah, if I can. The first coping mechanism, I believe, in the Somali context has always been the clan, beyond the family. If there was protection, clearly to the extent that you found refuge, if you like, within your clan structure, that is the first place you go. And those were not necessarily limited to the modern nation-state boundaries. Clans in the post-colonial period spanned over borders, and people moved freely there, and to the extent that that was possible, clearly found refuge elsewhere, out of harm's way. When it comes to natural disasters, when it comes to droughts, this is obviously going to be much more difficult. So for me, the clear distinction between a coping mechanism and a symptom is whether it is voluntary or not. If you are displaced involuntarily, whether it is by drought or by the political forces at play, I think you're in a different situation. I wouldn't necessarily call this a coping mechanism. It is an inadequate response in the short term to deal with an immediate threat. And thereafter, everything else has to happen. For me, there is also a humanitarian short-term element in it, if you like, and a long-term one that clearly could be a developmental component in it. And this is where the challenges are now in the air and are being discussed across the street here. What do we do in post-2015? The word displacement did not find itself in the MDGs. Yet it is going to be a defining issue of our times. And it will become a bigger issue, not a lesser issue. I hope the so-called sustainable development goals post-2015 will indeed include displacement as a key developmental issue and not simply relegated to a humanitarian issue. But that is precisely the challenge. How do we influence an intergovernmental process to take cognizance of this new phenomenon and to make sure that it is, in fact, addressed? Thank you.
Samuel, would you like to add something on this point?
Yeah, just short. Two things. When I was really many years back, I wouldn't tell you my age, but many years back when I was growing up, when I was a young boy in Liberia, almost maybe every other year we have this Nigerian, the Malian, from the Sahel with their kids, they migrate to down south of West Africa. They are maybe in the street corners selling stuff and things like that. And then after a while, once they know that the season of drought has ended, they suddenly disappear. They're back home. And then after a year, another year, for the last 50 years, if you want to calculate my age, I have seen those. And then, if you watch National Geography, many of us who watch, you see certain season, some colony of birds move to Australia, and then they wait for the season, and then they come back to their former habitat. It is a natural tendency for environmental determined movement of people and creatures over time. We know that. It is because we need to also be much more responsive to that natural reality and have the appropriate policies that make that possible, make that feasible for humans and every other thing that move based on environment to have that movement opportunity. This does not necessarily mean that governments and state institutions should not make sure that all of the other vulnerabilities that push people to move are not addressed in the context, in the capacity of those institutions to address them. But the natural movement, it should be part of our socio-economic landscape and our socio-economic logic that we develop. And I think this is where Walter and others have been pushing over the years.
Thank you. So I would like now to give you the floor for questions. And I see already that we have somebody here who wants to intervene. Before that, I would like just to remind you of a few housekeeping rules. First, mention your name and affiliation, please, when you take the floor. And then, since we are webcasting this event live, I would like to ask you to keep your microphone steady to ensure the good recording of your question, to make sure that people watching the event online can also hear you. With this, I would like to give the floor to Ambassador Douale.
I'm Douale, Ambassador of Somalia, and I have first and foremost to thank, as usual, the moderator and also the IPI, because always these debates are very enlightening, and especially in particular this one, which is on East Africa. and the problems that we have faced in the Horn of Africa. Among the countries of the Horn of Africa, I think Somalia is one of those who had a very chronic problems caused first by humans, compounded by nature, as was mentioned, droughts and floods. After the droughts, we always get floods that destroy more or the same amount of crops, people, and livestock. Let me get my glasses. I believe that the panelists have already mentioned most of the problems, so I will not prolong much on that areas. But what is it now? What is exactly now today in Somalia, the situation? The situation definitely had improved after the November 2013 Security Council resolution, which allowed for more AMISOM troops, and which who are now even from West Africa, not only from East Africa or from IGAD, but include now Sierra Leone and Nigeria, police. And also allowed the Somali contingent, Somali armed forces who are with AMISOM in the forefront to be assisted, which before was not there. Plus, there is also a UN trust fund, which has been established but yet has not borne any fruits. So now the problems we have seen, the conflict, the drought, the floods, the IDPs within the country, which have mentioned in the millions, the refugees also, which is over some kind of 1 million, in a country which is supposed to have about 12 million people. So it is quite a number of population. Now, the problem of resilience has always been a problem, even during peaceful times in Somalia. And now, the remittances which were coming from outside for these internally displaced people and those who remain because they cannot move out is being jeopardized by some banks, international banks. So the good things are that now both the international community, the United Nations, and especially the African Union and IGAD have now tried to become much, much more committed, especially in the African Union, so that it's now foreseen, hopefully, that as Somalia's problems decrease and liberated areas have some administration, some police, some stability, then returnees can come. And not now, because the pressure from Kenya is there, that they are fed up with the refugees and they want them to come back. But as the UNHCR knows, still it's not possible. The same thing with the IDPs, the internally displaced persons, who are mainly in the big cities and have no other survival. They cannot survive unless their children beg in the streets, and until that there is the humanitarian organizations that will give them something. The areas that have been liberated also have the problem of now creating an administration, effective administration, building their own organizational capabilities, stabilizing, giving policing, and structural development as far as possible. whether they are in the agro pastoralist areas or in the nomadic pastoralist areas. So now, practically, economically, Somalia is down, not only because of the security situations, but because the economic resources are not there anymore. So we hope soon we will survive. Now, there are good lessons, which is now the solidarity of these sub-regional organizations in Africa, the regional organization, the international community who finally is coming up with more assistance and support. And the UN in general is now also, all United Nations agencies are present there in Somalia now, and they are really helping. And I hope soon we will see conditions conducive to the return of refugees and displaced persons. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for sharing your perspective on this issue. Before giving a chance to our panelists maybe to react to some of those comments, I'd like to take one or two additional questions if you have questions. So anybody? Maureen?
Hi, Maureen Quinn from the International Peace Institute. You talked about, if I caught it correct, the Uganda Convention, and that it was innovated on some of these issues. So could you give be a little bit more specific? How is it innovative? Have those innovations been put into practice? What could other regions learn from it? Thank you.
Any other question? If not, I will go back to our panelists, maybe in the same order. Walter, do you want to react or answer all these questions?
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your really enlightening analysis of the current situation. What you were alluding to is one further challenge that we didn't mention so much, namely how to transit from an emergency humanitarian response to durable solutions. It's an old, well-known problem, but I feel it's particularly acute in the case of Somalia, and intrinsically linked to recovery and rebuilding of the country as a precondition so that IDPs and refugees can return. And I think there we really need to be much more innovative and make more progress. It's a problem still in too many cases that humanitarian assistance drags on because we are not really able to make that transition. As regards the Kampala Convention, first it's innovative insofar as it's the first international law instrument, meaning hard law instrument, to protect internally displaced persons. The guiding principles on internal displacement, they have been recognized by the states back the Millennium Summit outcome document as framework for the protection of IDPs, but that's soft law. The Kampala Convention is hard law. It's innovative insofar as it is not only setting out rights of IDPs, but more importantly, obligations of the different actors, the governments, but also the regional organizations, the international community. So it's focusing very much on the duty bearers. And when you're talking about implementation, that's the first step to make clear who is responsible. How far are we? The convention has been adopted back in 2009. It takes, of course, quite some time then to get it through the ratification procedures in the different countries. So we are now at the stage of starting to have a substantial number of ratifications, but it's a very demanding convention, and it needs a lot of implementing legislation. It needs a lot of building of the relevant institutions. It needs specific measures to link the principles and the institutions to financial mechanisms, so resources are available. And we are starting to move into that phase. The African Union is in the course of finalizing a model law that can be used by countries as a source of inspiration. But the big challenge for the next few years is very much to get that legislation in place, to build and reinforce those institutions and look at the financial mechanisms. In that way, we are going through something that UNHCR was pushing very much in the aftermath of the adoption of the, at that time, OAU Convention on Refugees, where the first step really was to build those legal frameworks and institutional systems. And this is and remains a big challenge. So we're not there yet, but the first important steps have been made.
Udo, would you like to add something?
Well, that makes my job very easy because I don't have to add much more. But, as with the OAU Refugee Convention, that provided a much more conducive space, if you like, for the continent to provide protection also for those who were fleeing situations of generalized violence. This new convention on IDPs, which is hard law, and came into force in December 2012 after 15 states had originally ratified it and is now up to 22, will again go much further than what the guiding principles that we have used until now have tried to codify in a soft law attempt. But it goes much further to specifically mention, in fact, IDPs due to natural hazards, man-made or human-made disasters, including climate change effects. It's already in a convention. So clearly, this will take us much, much further than what we have been able to do until now. But of course, the proof will be in the pudding. The institutions are not there. Clearly, the compact is not there because you need both. The burden sharing that was related to earlier refers to both the country of origin and those that can assist in creating those very conditions that will ultimately enable people to return. And there you look at, whatever you want to call it, the objective conditions on the ground, the infrastructure, the macro conditions to be in place, starting first and foremost with security. But then you also need that individual element, that subjective element, to enable people to actually do something useful, constructive, to anchor them renewed in their locality. That needs a bit of investment. But frankly, from my reading, it is a far more productive investment than all the deterrence measures that I see all the time in countries of asylum, to build the fence ever higher, to create ever higher barriers, or to put huge amounts of cash into basically deterrent measures to try to prevent people from coming. You will not succeed with that approach. It is quite clear. People will always be a step ahead of us. You can build the walls as high as you want. Every individual that is returned back to the starting point by a Frontex boat will try the same again 3 days later on another boat, but it will drive the price of the smugglers up. So there are a few things that I think we need to do. For one, I think we must curtail the smuggling business. This is clearly a no-brainer. You have to take that market away. At the moment, I think the figures point to the net gains from human cargo smuggling to be much, much higher than even the gun running and the smuggling and even the heroin trafficking. And the advantage is that the cargo has legs and feet. They walk away. There's no evidence if they succeed. Unfortunately, as we heard again, many do not succeed, and that's when it hits the headlines. So we must increase our efforts, clearly, and that goes across regions and even beyond. It cannot be confined to one area. It needs a lot of collaboration across the international community. Secondly, I think once we have created conditions in one form or another that at least enable some people on a voluntary basis to return and pick up the pieces where they left them, then clearly there will be a bit of a momentum that will build up so that ultimately you have people seriously contemplating in a camp, in a settlement like in Dadaab, whether or not it pays, in fact, to continue to remain there, which is for them an issue of personal safety and security, or whether it is now time to make that jump and to seriously consider returning home. Before that balance tilts, a lot will have to happen, clearly, but I think it's the only hope and it's the only answer in the long term. Thank you.
Thank you, Udo. We heard during this discussion that displacement is indeed, as Sam mentioned before, a natural reality. It is a coping mechanism. We also heard that free movement across border can have some benefits for states. For instance, on smuggling, it can be not so much a disincentive, but might remove the very grounds for smuggling of human people. So maybe it is a naive question that I will ask to all of you, but how can we, do you have some examples of that could make the case, leverage the case of migration, displacement as a positive phenomenon, including for countries of destination?
I'm sure I'm not the expert on migration, especially when I'm sitting with Jens and Walter. What can I say? But I just want to, I'm sure all of us have followed this. Some recent World Bank statistics that seem to suggest that that remittances are increasingly becoming far more higher than even ODAs, isn't it? I think last year it was around $550 billion of money movement in terms of real money, official, not money laundering, not the ones that come from third world dictators into banks in Switzerland or other places, but money of hardworking migrants across the world who have come out to raise some money, send money back home to their families, try to make sure that people survive, kids go to school. That was $550 billion, much, much higher than our official development assistance that we have had. So I think there is something to harness out of that, something that one can build on using migration, creating policies that make migration easier, policies that make remittances easier and legitimate, and make sure that laundering money and other crimes are outside of those legitimate funds that can be brought back home, and to build the solidarity. That's an important part of the global solidarity necessary to eradicate poverty. So we need to invest a bit more in that. I just also wanted to point out quickly, if we want to maybe address the issue of the vices of migration and population movement, probably since 3 decades of Somalia sad situation, I think it is time, and the world seems to be responding to that all of us need to invest and rally around the people of Somalia to really rebuild their state. Through the New Deal process, the compact that the EU organized a conference in Brussels, governments and donors have pledged about $2.4 billion to help Somalia rebuild the state. All of us need to make sure that those pledges are met with, they are met in time. We invest in understanding what sort of state that needs to be built in Somalia. Is it a state as we understand it, or is it a state as the Somalia socio-historical, cultural context understand it? And that sort of dialogue needs to take place between the people of Somalia and the international community, like ourselves in UNDP, that are keen on accompanying Somalia to build a habitat that will bring and attract its people back home, not a habitat that will drive them away in a horrific way as we see through the Gulf of Eden. Thank you.
Walter, did you want to react to this?
Yes, just building a bit up on it and expanding. what we have learned within the Nansen Initiative from other consultations in the Pacific region and in Central America is first, we need a protection regime for those people who are forced to move. That's very clear. And this is about access. This is about being treated in accordance with human rights standards. And this is about, for those who can return, and I'm talking here not about permanent loss of a substantial part of state territory, such as in the Pacific region, that they can return back in dignity and safety, rebuild their lives. But one should not wait till it's reaching that level. And that's where the idea of facilitating migration, voluntary migration as an adaptation measure comes in, about facilitating migration so that people can move. And again, we have different forms. Very much it's about remittances. Some part of the family, one family member moving out, maybe just for a few months, making money, and it helps the family to stay back home. So in that sense, facilitating that kind of migration even is a preventive measure, so not the whole family or the whole community will be displaced. And sometimes it's about permanent migration, some people having to move permanently. And there again, it's a question of how it's being done. There is a danger that people end up the way we were talking about, being marginalized, being exploited, risking their lives. Or it can be well planned and people being prepared. And again, to look at other regions, we had very interesting discussions in the Pacific region with some small island states that risk to really lose large parts of their state territory, about preparing people by educating them, by making them fit for a globalized labor market. This too helps. And this is then the situation where receiving states can profit, because those immigrating will contribute to their own economies.
Thank you, Walter. Udo, would you like to add something?
And a small addition, I think, even though I'm not representing a migration agency, as I'm sure those of you who are in the business know, Erica Fellow, who was one of our enlightened staff members who has been with the organization for a long, long time, until she retired as Assistant High Commissioner for Protection, said once that refugees always are part of a mixed movement of people. You have had, for centuries, you had people move according to opportunity. A friend of mine once used the slogan, "A million wildebeests can't be wrong." And I think there's something in it, frankly. Why do we subject that instinct to go where the green grass grows through the imposition of new frontiers where none existed before? So if we have a situation in the Horn of Africa where clan-based structures basically manage to ignore those frontiers for generations, maybe that is the first answer we should look at. Maybe they need, a travel document that allows them to freely move around the Horn of Africa. I mean, this sounds a figment of my own imagination, but it would be nice, no? Imagine. There's no doubt in my mind, and I think the figures speak for itself, that migratory movements into the receiving countries has a positive effect, as well as in the sending countries. There's no doubt in my mind about that. And I think it is also a fact of life that we live in a multicultural society globally. No country can build enough walls up to be mono-ethnic, monocultural, mono-religious. Those days, fortunately, are over. And I think any attempt to roll back the clock would be futile. So for me, there are a number of reasons why we need a much more constructive approach like the one outlined by Professor Kalin, because this is what we need to plan for now. The idea of planning for population movements, even just a few years ago, was sacrilege. You couldn't possibly think about those things, because ultimately this is up to the individuals or to the governments to to address. But what do you do if you are in Kiribati today? What do you do if you are living in coastal areas in Bangladesh where you see the conditions worsening year after year after year? Sooner or later, you will begin to think yourself, as well as the community and maybe even the government, of what we need to do to plan an orderly and perhaps preventive move before, it is too late. So this is what I think is the promise of getting organized and really using our capacities collectively to see what else can be done rather than, dealing with the crisis when it happens.
Yes, Walter, I will give you back the floor right away. I think we are reaching the end of our discussions. I wanted to give you precisely an opportunity for a last thought, except if somebody in the audience has a burning question, and I would ask you to. So maybe we can take this last question here from the gentleman on the second row. I will ask you to be quite short and straight to the point. And then after answering this question, we will turn back to the panelists for a quick final comment to close this discussion. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Thilo Stolz. I work in the Department of Political Affairs, Africa 2 Division. And this is probably a question for Mr. Doe, which is in terms of what has the UN system, UNDP and others together, like with UNEP, for instance, been doing in looking into innovative solutions such as micro-irrigation? Also, can you use solar energy to power desalination plants, things of that nature to facilitate basically agricultural production through innovation in terms of irrigation and other technologies? Thank you.
So, Samuel, please, you can address this question. Then I will ask you also to maybe give your final comment or wrap up to close this discussion.
Thank you. Yes, I think this is an area that UNDP and many other UN agencies that work on the ground, FAO, UNICEF and others have been looking. I mean, energy, especially energy for women, helping women build their capacity, having efficient energy supply is one of the programs that UNDP works with. Also, social protection mechanisms, social protection scheme is an area that our poverty group and our economic and livelihood program focus on as well. We work with IGAD, as we've talked about. IGAD's strategic plan has covered many of these areas: social protection, energy, water supply, efficient water supply across those difficult communities. And these are areas where, through the accompaniment, the support we provide to IGAD and to the programs that the IGAD countries implement, tend to cover as well. So it's still limited. I think we encourage a lot of agencies to get involved more and more in many of these areas. And EU, with the IGS program, have been working a bit more closely in the Sahel around many of these programs. I think the Rockefeller Foundation also is intending to invest a bit more money, especially in the Horn of Africa, to focus on this area as well, including USAID. So that collective mobilization of international system using the resilience lens, drawing on some of those programs you've talked about, will be one way to move the dent that we have. Then
before turning back to Walter Kellin for the ultimate remarks and the reflections, Udo, would you like to share with us your final thoughts? Two thoughts in closing.
The trend is in the Mediterranean that while overall arrivals are down in Europe, numbers of sea arrivals are up. Now that should give us some food for thought. The barriers, the land barriers, obviously have been strengthened. And what do people do? They go for the alternative that is easier. Obviously, the demography has changed also in terms of who is coming today. It is mostly Syrians, surprise, surprise, who are coming via Egypt, via Libya, by boats to Europe. But the numbers from sub-Saharan Africa and the Horn continue unabated to arrive in one form or another with every sailing season. Now, clearly, something needs to be done about it. As I said before, I think every dollar spent in the place of origin, for me, is money better spent than in building the fence. But there is another obvious aspect that has put a spanner in the works to do something constructively, and that is what the High Commissioner addressed on Tuesday this week when he visited South Sudan. I mean, in the spate of 100 days, the country has produced now 3.7 million people at risk of food insecurity. More than 1 million people fled their homes as IDPs, and it will spread over the whole region like a cancer. And this will be the distraction from doing anything useful on the current issue that we are trying to address here, but it's clearly a man-made complication. In this case, it's the other way around. There may well be reasons that you find in nature why we have a conflict-prone environment in the South Sudan. This time, the compounding factor was man-made and not the other way around. And the short-term output you will see with those figures. So this is perhaps sounding a little bit doomsday-ish at the end of our presentation, but this is the reality, I'm afraid, that we deal with at this particular moment in time. Thank you.
Well, maybe Walter will have some final thoughts that will be a bit more hopeful and less doomsday. Please. But I think it is important as a reality check to remember that it is a growing issue indeed. Walter, the final word is for you.
Yes, and it will be more positive. So what do we need to do? Of course, and I was very happy about the last question, we need to invest into allowing people to stay. Prevention, building resilience. This is an aspect we have not been really addressing during this event, but that's number one. But we need, second, also to realize that with all these investments into prevention, adaptation, people will move, and we have to prepare for that. So we have to build population movements into disaster risk reduction programs, into climate change adaptation and resilience activities. For instance, by also strengthening the resilience of host communities that will receive people, or even resilience of people, communities that have to move while they are on the move. We need to facilitate migration as an adaptive measure, voluntary migration, facilitating temporary or permanent migration. And we need access for those displaced across borders, protection, and robust investment into durable solutions so that they can return. The positive thing is that I feel in the Horn of Africa, the discussion is further advanced than in the other regions. All these issues are discussed, and many activities are undertaken. I think His Excellency, the Ambassador from Somalia, would agree that the readiness of neighboring countries to accept people displaced from Somalia is really very, very impressive. Governments are ready to admit people, to protect them. Not everything is ideal. There are the big challenges. But in that sense, I think one can learn from the region. And as I said, part of the Nansen Initiative's consultation in the Horn of Africa is to feed into a global consultation process to arrive at what we call a protection agenda that will lay out the next steps. And there are certainly lessons learned, including good practices from the Horn of Africa, will be very prominent. Thank you.
Well, I would like to thank all our panelists for a very complex, broad, but fascinating discussion, and to thank our audience for being us with here today. So thank you, everybody.